Our morning keynote speaker, who I really appreciate, is participating, Representative Knute Buehler. Many of you know is candidate for governor in the state of Oregon. Elected to the legislature in 2015. I learned he's the first Rhodes Scholar from the state of Oregon. Also a physician and is in private practice in Bend, Oregon, and we really appreciate that he has made time to come chat with us to offer his vision for healthcare in Oregon and take some questions from me as we go around and solve at least some of the great problems in Oregon healthcare. Representative Buehler, why don't you come to the stage? Let's give him a warm round of applause. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
DJ. Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for being here today, especially on what it seems like the first winter day of 2017. There's good and bad about that. I think it's the first time I've worn my winter jacket, which is a little disappointing in some ways. But the good thing is when I put my hands in the pocket, I found that pair of headphones that I've been missing all summer long. So that's a good part. Well, thank you very much for having me. DJ, thank you for your kind introduction, and especially for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's truly an honor for me. As a doctor and a lawmaker, as a candidate now, I thank each of you for the work you do advancing healthcare. It's not easy work, as you know, and creating better health outcomes for all Oregonians. Our shared ideas and values, the relationships we strengthen here, and importantly, and probably most importantly, the actions we take when we leave here, I know and have in the past made Oregon a better place. When it comes to healthcare policy, and certainly healthcare politics, which I find myself involved in more and more, we're living in some of the best of times, and I would say, unfortunately, some of the worst of times. And this morning, I'll share just a bit of my personal background against the stark backdrop, the backdrop of both innovation and now profound uncertainty that exists in the healthcare sector in Oregon. And I'll also define the greatest single threat to Oregon's remarkable, and I do mean remarkable, 30-year experiment in healthcare innovation. The single greatest threat is partisanship. And I think you all feel it. I feel it. And I'll take up the challenge which Governor Kitzhaber so eloquently put forth right here last year when he asked us all to contribute to the next chapter, an important next chapter of healthcare transformation in Oregon. And finally, I'll finish briefly with an outline of what I think the next steps should be to continue Oregon's innovative and proud, very proud healthcare policy legacy. Now, when I was 12 years old, my dad had a devastating stroke. He was just 49 years of age, and it left him unable to use most of the left side of his body, mainly his left arm and his left leg. And think for a moment what it was like for a strong, proud man, a butcher, a Navy guy, a veteran, a guy who had never missed a single day of work in his entire life because of sickness, and overnight he found himself in a wheelchair. It was a humbling and life-changing experience for the entire Bueller family, as you can imagine. And for a 12-year-old boy like me, it was an early lesson in the hard realities of life and how it can change so suddenly and be so impactful. But healthcare impacts the entire family, just not the person in need of care. And likewise, healthcare impacts our communities and I'd say increasingly our entire state. Now, neither one of my parents had the opportunity to graduate from high school. I do say opportunity. Just think of that. A generation ago, they overcome such daunting challenges as a life-changing medical condition and not a well-rounded education, and raised 3 boys in Roseburg. Each of us earned college degrees and went on to successful professional careers. My parents, along with my older brothers, fortunately I had 2 older brothers who looked after me frequently, wonderful teachers at Roseburg High School, and many others, helped me see a future even in some of those darkest days when I was a teenager. A future asking, what if? What's next? And probably most importantly, why not me? A future which allowed a blue-collar kid from Roseburg to know really no limits and be a huge beneficiary of Oregon's public education system. And eventually, I came to love medicine. In fact, I love medicine so much that I even married a doctor. And my wife, Patty, I met in medical school. And some of you may know her. She's an eye surgeon currently in Bend. And while in medical school together in Baltimore, it was a particularly impactful experience. I remember in my second year of being in medical school, I delivered a baby addicted to crack cocaine. In my third year, I remember taking care of a 14-year-old who was nearly shot to death in street violence. And throughout my entire 4 years, I helped take care of dozens and dozens of previously healthy young men who were afflicted with a new and uncertain disease, HIV/AIDS, and never left the hospital. What I learned through those experiences is that in medicine, we combine the satisfaction of helping people in their time of utmost need, vulnerability, and I'd say even fear, with a love of science, inquiry, and innovation. Truly a wonderful combination, and those of us who are blessed to be healthcare providers are very, very fortunate. So when Patty and I both graduated from medical school, and we considered our next move, the answer for me, fortunately the answer for both of us, because Patty agreed to this plan, was simple. It was home. Home to Oregon. And there was a good reason for that. There was a very good reason, because at the time, and many of you in this room remember, Oregon was developing a well-deserved reputation as a trailblazer, as an innovator in healthcare. Under Governor Kitzhaber with the Oregon Health Plan and the development of programs like the Oregon Trauma System. There was a time when we didn't have a trauma system in Oregon. Oregon was at the forefront, leading the way even nationally in healthcare policy. Great days for Oregon. As you can imagine, this was a real attraction for 2 young, budding surgeons. And since 1991, we've served on the front lines of healthcare in Oregon, from serving patients on a daily basis, to developing medical products, to serving on all kinds of health boards, including health system boards, and one of my particularly favorite activities being the team physician Friday night for high school football games. And recently, I've been an elected leader and served in state healthcare policy making and budgeting. It's been an eye-opening, humbling, and inspiring career. But when I look at where we are under our current failed leadership, I'm discouraged. I would say I'm deeply, deeply disappointed. And it's what motivates me to now try to produce the change and the new direction that I think we need. Because truly the future of Oregon's proud healthcare legacy is at stake. As you can imagine, from my background, healthcare is my passion. It tends to be a little personal for someone who's dedicated their career to it. And like many of you, I've dedicated my life to taking care of other people. As a doctor and a lawmaker, I believe crafting healthcare policy should be about facts and ideas, not about special interests, and certainly not about political parties. The troublesome collusion of special interests and career politicians clashes with the truth. It troubles me. Truly, it troubles me. It keeps me up at night, which may sound a little dramatic, but like many of you in this audience, I see what's happening to healthcare firsthand in the trenches. We have a developing crisis in this state. Now, I'm clear-eyed. I'm clear-eyed, especially after 4 years of being a candidate, a legislator, about the reality of politics. But that can't allow us. It can't allow us to glaze over the greatest threat facing Oregon healthcare policy. Because under our current governor, we are marching toward unbridled, fact-free DC-style politics. This disease of partisanship at the federal level has unfortunately now infected the body politic here in Oregon. In Salem, just like in Washington, D.C., I'm sorry to report, especially after this last legislative session, that dominating the argument with raw political power has now replaced building durable consensus based on shared values and facts. And the chaos, corruption, I would say even failure that results creates big obstacles. For example, a portion of the Medicaid budget on the statewide ballot now in January where it clearly doesn't belong. A premeditated plot to smear a nonprofit health care provider in the public arena. Insider insurance deals for big corporations and big unions, blocking veterans' access to much-needed mental health care, and tolerating hundreds of millions of wasted Medicaid dollars spent on websites and enrollment technology, and millions and millions and millions of dollars more on people not even eligible to receive state benefits. And all the while, our governor retreats from her promises of accountability and transparency, literally standing by as a spectator as these important debates continue. Too little accountability, too little transparency, and way too much scandal. And it doesn't have to be this way. We know a time when it hasn't been this way. Creating health care policy in Oregon has broad and proud bipartisan traditions. What happened? What happened to our values of public service and serving the public good? In the early 1990s, it was 3 Republican lawmakers, Greg Walden, Gordon Smith, and I believe Larry Campbell, who with Democrat Governor Barbara Roberts brokered a plan to create a new dedicated funding source for Democrat John Kitzhaber's Oregon Health Plan. The Affordable Care Act in Oregon even enjoyed overwhelming, near unanimous bipartisan support, as did the creation of the Coordinated Care Organizations, the CCOs, an innovative, new but somewhat risky program. And in recent years, I've worked closely with Democrats to pass health care legislation, like the nation's first law to essentially make birth control functionally over the counter. I've worked with Democrats to pass bills that allow terminally ill patients in Oregon access to potentially life-changing, life-saving experimental drugs and other treatments. And work closely with Democrats, some of who are in this room today, to strengthen Oregon's response to the opioid epidemic, a horrible, horrible national crisis, in innovative ways that have been particularly impactful in our state. So you can imagine, during my time in Salem, I've learned a lot. It's really been like getting a PhD in politics and policy. And I've learned what remarkable things can happen when you work together, when you respect the diversity of opinion, and you combine the best Republican ideas with the best Democratic ideas, all the while with the mission to put Oregonians first. The same could have happened in this past legislative session with regards to the Medicaid budget. Rather than jamming it through with an arm-twisting, mostly party line vote, a group of us offered an alternative plan that would have protected Medicaid for everyone and avoided a costly new sales tax on health care. We could have prevented a costly, divisive ballot measure, which we now face, and offered the legislature, the governor, state health care managers the time, the freedom, and flexibility to develop much-needed bipartisan reforms and improvements to address the problems, and we all know there are serious problems currently plaguing our $8.4 billion Medicaid program. Governor Brown and her legislative allies were fixated on ramming through a piece of legislation that they rejected, unfortunately, real debate on the serious issues. And too often, I see this all too often in Salem, especially on critical issues where some people are more interested in monologues instead of having robust and meaningful dialogues. Earlier this summer, I called for a special session to have that kind of dialogue, why we had time to fix problems and restore certainty to our Medicaid program and those who depend on it. It was rejected. Governor Brown and a few powerful politicians have made a deliberate choice, and I do believe this is a deliberate choice now, to dominate and change the healthcare debate in Oregon with partisan, toxic politics instead of building durable, partisan consensus. It's a sad day in Oregon politics. But I'm fairly certain that if Governor Kitzhaber had taken this approach with the original Oregon Health Plan, it likely never would have survived a decade of subsequent Republican control of the Oregon legislature in the 1990s. And we only have to look to Washington, D.C. the past decade to see the failure of this partisan approach. We need to learn. And let me be clear, both parties, Republican and Democrat, are at fault with this partisanship. But it's clear to me, and it should be clear to you, that you cannot sustain complex government programs, be it health care or others, without bipartisan buy-in and bipartisan ownership. Now, as a doctor, when you come to me for help, I don't ask how you're registered to vote. I don't care if you're Republican, I don't care if you're a Democrat, I don't care if you're independent or even none of the above. I ask you questions. I want to know what your problem is. I study the issues. I follow the facts wherever they may lead me, and I collaborate with others to try to solve your problems. This is how I've led, and you can still lead that way. I've led this way as a state representative, and this is how I would lead as your governor. And you can be sure of this. As governor, every Oregonian who is eligible for Medicaid will not lose sleep over how it's funded. Unlike Governor Brown, under my watch, no one falls under the cracks. To write our next chapter in Oregon's healthcare innovation story, we must capture that independent, I call it post-partisan political center, where facts are not feared. Bipartisan cooperation is put into practice and not merely remembered from those days gone by. It truly, truly is a matter of life and death for some Oregonians. And this next chapter, our next chapter in healthcare policy in Oregon, comes at a critical point. More people than ever depend on Medicaid now in this state. The fledgling CCOs have proven that they have a viable concept that was developed here. And now 93% of Oregonians have health care coverage. Those are great accomplishments. I think we could all agree. But at the same time, people running our government have not developed a reliable and sustainable funding solution to Medicaid. Some national Republicans in Congress are trying to gut the program completely. The individual market is increasingly unaffordable for too many Oregonians, and CCOs desperately need to be updated. So what does this look like? How do we solve these problems? Let me outline a little bit of my vision of these. First, we need to organize a group of stakeholders to forge a thoughtful bipartisan solution to fund and protect Medicaid and also to sustain and stabilize the individual market. We now know that the referral will most likely be on the ballot in January, but my contention is no matter if it passes or fails, these problems are still needing to be solved. And it'll take people like you in this room rolling up your sleeves, putting our heads together, and trying to solve them. And I think reasonable people can agree that the future of Medicaid should not be litigated on the campaign trail, that it's too important, the consequences are too real to be handled in 30-second political ads. And as Governor Kitzhaber said just this week, quote, "We're going to have to change both the focus and the tone of the debate. There's not a partisan solution to health care. There's only a solution that recognizes that we're all in this together." I think that sums it up quite well. Next, we need to continue the evolution of our CCOs. And I'm proposing really 4 structural changes. First, we need to update the governance and increase accountability. There are mechanisms for community input and oversight building into the original CCO model, but the resounding feedback from Oregonians is that the opportunities for community involvement and transparency need to be enhanced. I think that's true. We should create, in my opinion, 12 regional health councils. These organizations would represent the diverse interests of our communities and people, and they'd be responsible for aligning interests to produce positive results on the social determinants of health, in coordination and with CCO leadership. CCOs, of course, would continue their focus on integrating physical, behavioral, and dental health. Next, number 2, we need to address the underinvestments in the social determinants of health. CCOs have done an excellent job in managing spending, starting to coordinate care among providers, and tying public resources, importantly, to good health outcomes. But the transition to addressing the external factors to healthcare, or the social determinants of health, has been too slow. CCOs and the state of Oregon, I would say, despite 5 years of effort, still try to impact human health primarily through a narrow window, a narrow lens of healthcare, traditional healthcare, and the rate-setting methodology just now reinforces this approach. It's got to change. Healthcare is only one small part, and as I get older, I recognize this more and more. Healthcare is only one small part of what constitutes an individual's overall health. Strong communities, affordable housing, adequate income, access to quality education all play an integral role in creating and sustaining healthy lives. Healthy communities at their core have people who are not only physically healthy, but are educated, employed, and engaged in their community. Third, the third change, structural change to CCOs that I'd like to see is it's time. It's time to speed up the transition to value-based payment methodologies. One of the original goals of the CCOs, as you know, was to wean the system off traditional provider payment methods. However, after several years, we still see too little progress. Unfortunately, the same system that rewards delivering care can disincentivize taking risks, keeping people healthy, and even innovating. And finally, fourth, we need to fully integrate behavioral health with physical and dental services. There's a growing realization in our current behavioral health system that our current behavioral system is insufficient and, quite frankly, overwhelmed. And this is due to a variety of causes, including decades of mismanagement. But whatever the causes, the result is an epidemic of addiction and mental illness that is devastating. Truly, truly devastating. And we see the fallout of this failure. We see the fallout of this failure of our behavioral health system every single day. The failure reflected in the tent cities and desperate faces on our downtown streets. We should restructure the current system and fully integrate it into the CCO model. It's not working now. There should be one point of shared responsibility and oversight for community behavioral health through the CCOs. They'd coordinate outcome and funding across the integrated system, contracting with a variety of behavioral health care providers. They all and everyone should share in the same mission of creating healthy individuals, but there should be only one organization who's accountable for coordinating all these efforts. But what's required to make all this happen? In my judgment, here's what's missing: innovative, bipartisan leadership. Courageous leadership, unafraid to break from her or his own political party. Leadership with an open mind, a thoughtful voice, and importantly, a caring heart. You see, you can be bold. You can be bold. You can be bold in 21st century America and still be sensible. It's possible. We just haven't seen it done in a very long time. In the complexity of healthcare policy, in legislative committees back in your offices later today, we hear about numbers, funding formulas, recipients, and caseloads. And it's easy to forget the people behind that paperwork. But that's what we're really all here to do. We're here to help and to heal real people. And what we need is innovative, bipartisan leadership, for it has the power to heal all of us. And sometimes we get distracted by special interest and political gamesmanship and forget it's really about the people we serve and the people who need our help. Oregonians who need a helping hand from a compassionate and effective state government. For some, it's just a temporary condition, and for others, it's a permanent safety net. And we owe it to each of them. And for that matter, I think I would say that we owe it to every generous, hardworking Oregonian taxpayer who may never need access to publicly provided health care, to get this right, to see the facts, the truth, and cooperation are not weaknesses. Cooperation and truth and facts are not weaknesses, but it should be our guiding principles that make our policy stronger and more durable. And friends, we're at a tipping point here in Oregon. We truly are. We need innovative bipartisan leadership so we can heal, take care of the disease of partisanship, and update our healthcare system. This is about human lives at the end of the day, and it's about providing opportunities for successful citizens in creating healthy, vibrant communities all across our state. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts with you today, and I look forward to talking with you more later through the morning. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Let's grab a chair. Let's sit down, make ourselves a little more comfortable. Let me start sort of at a non-healthcare topic.
Is that allowed here?
Well, I'm on the stage asking the questions, so I guess so. Oregon has a rich history of Republican elected officials. It has changed to some degree, like the Mark Hatfields of the world are becoming now Dennis Richardsons, and that's not a good, bad, or indifferent. It's just saying it's a transition. Okay. What does a Knute Buehler Republican look like?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And the nice thing is that Knute Buehler has been in the legislature for 4 years and has a real track record. And a Knute Buehler Republican looks like someone who refuses to accept those narrow partisan labels, that is an independent thinker who looks for bipartisan solutions. And I think we've done that through a number of efforts in the legislature. For example, my efforts at healthcare, some of the things we've done that have brought people together, Democrats and Republicans, even on some very controversial areas with regards to access to contraception, which in some areas, some places in this country, and even Washington, D.C., it's a conversation you can't even start. Here, we not only started the conversation, but created a groundbreaking law that increases access to contraception more than anywhere else in the nation, is being used as a model elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of Republican Knute Buehler is.
On the environment?
On the environment, that is something that is true to me. I am very much for supporting and protecting the environment in reasonable ways, in new ways, and thoughtful ways. I think my experience in the legislature, again, helping pass the Coal to Clean bill. In fact, I rolled up my sleeves along with a couple other Republicans that supported that bill, and that's an important piece of legislation. But it's clear also that what we're doing in this state with regards to managing our forest and fighting forest fires is just clearly not working anymore. And it's not working clearly because it's devastating the economics of much of rural Oregon, but it's also not working from an environmental perspective. The forest fires this summer, 600,000 acres released and had a bigger carbon footprint than driving all of the cars in Oregon for 3 years.
Let me interject.
And it has important health implications, as we all know from this summer's air quality. And look at that evidence. Look at the evidence of what it does to people's health. Just a few days of breathing the smoke is pretty impactful.
Particularly in Bend, it was a mess, right?
Particularly in Bend. But that's a good point. In Bend, in Central Oregon, we've suffered through those kinds of summers for the past 3 or 4 years. I think the rest of the state now, this summer, unfortunately, got a taste of the smoke that we smelled for a long time.
Is climate change real?
Sure.
Do you think, and I ask these questions because these are sort of, these are kind of code word for what kind of Republican are you? What do you think? It seems like it's hard to run statewide as a Republican and win. Doesn't happen too often. It seems like it's extraordinarily difficult to do it when you have a president like the one we have in Washington, D.C. What do you think of President Trump?
Yeah, that's a long ways from healthcare.
Well, the executive order apparently comes out tomorrow, so we'll see. But
yeah. Well, listen, I can't control President Trump. For that matter, sometimes I think President Trump can't control President Trump. So this election is about Oregon. This election is about solving big problems Big problems in Oregon that have been ignored for much too long and have caused big problems for lots of people who now feel left behind and, quite frankly, left out.
It seems like it's an extraordinarily difficult challenge, this DC stuff, right? Stuff is maybe a word that other people would use something stronger, but all of this stuff happening. Let me ask the same kind of question just differently, which is the Republican efforts at health policy reform in Washington, D.C. did not seem like they were about health policy from my perspective. They seemed like they were about other things, maybe politics or maybe tax policy. What are your observations on, because that will clearly impact the way Oregon runs its Medicaid program. What are your observations on maybe the specific policies that came out of that reform effort, or maybe how the Republicans in Congress handled it, or the Democrats in Congress handled it?
Yeah. Look, and I've said this many times, and I had an opinion piece earlier. I think the Affordable Care Act had good and bad portions. In my opinion, it needs to be repaired and reformed and not replaced. And the good part of it, and I think most of the people in this room would agree, was the Medicaid expansion. The part that didn't work out so well is the individual market. It's struggling mightily. And that's because we haven't introduced adequate cost controls. We've just poured more resources into it without acting for real delivery system reform and cost controls. And that's why we see premiums continuing to escalate to the point where we're really pricing people out of the market. Mm-hmm. And I think it was disingenuous. Disingenuous in two ways. Disingenuous with regards to the Obama administration to really front load the benefits and backload the cost, passing it on to the states 6 to 8 years later. And that's one of the big things driving our Medicaid budget crisis here in Oregon. I think it was disingenuous for Republicans at the national level for 6 years to continue to hammer away at the Affordable Care Act and not have a plan ready to go that had been vetted and had a consensus built around it. Mm-hmm. And those are the types of approaches. And both sides there are playing the politics, and that's what we have to avoid here in Oregon. We have to be honest, we have to be fact-based, and we have to come up with bipartisan policy that will stand the test of time.
So the referendum on the potentially likely on the ballot from Representative Parrish that would repeal the provider premium tax, the revenue package that came through this legislative session, coming up January 23rd, I think. Do you think? Do you think you're going to vote for that referendum? Do you think that should be settled law? What are your views on that?
I'll be a no vote. I'll be a no vote because we still haven't solved this problem, no matter if the referendum passes or not.
Yeah.
We still have a big Medicaid deficit in the next budget cycle. Because remember, what was passed in 17, the tax increases expire in 19. And then we have the concomitant stepping down of the federal dollars. We probably have another $600 billion deficit in the Medicaid budget, no matter if this passes.
Yeah.
And so we still have a problem to fix. I think it will stimulate discussion, and it should stimulate discussion in the short session. That's what the short session is for, is to solve these big fiscal problems. At least that's what the voters intended the short session to be, is to fix these big, urgent, mostly fiscal problems in the short session. That's where the discussion should be. We should be having that discussion right now. People in this room, we should be rolling up our sleeves and coming up a solution of how are we going to make Medicaid coverage sustainable over the long term. We're going to continue to see pressure of less federal funds. I'm convinced of that.
Yeah.
And then even a more difficult problem that we also need to consider, because they are linked. So how are we going to stabilize the individual market? How are we going to take care of that 5% of the population that many times uses close to 50% of the resources? Now that's a problem that we've been trying to solve for years, not only here, but across the country. Mm-hmm. And that's where innovation that this state has been known for needs to really address.
You know, the state state-based issues, particularly around financing, are just so enormous. If, as you know, as you said, it's not getting any easier whether the referendum passes or fails.
Yeah.
At lunch, former Governor Ted Kalinowski is going to join us, and he says he's very much an institutionalist. And he thinks a lot about this sort of federal-state interaction, as you're again talking about. How do you, if you're elected governor and have the honor to serve, what would your approach be in terms of this federal relationship, which is so critical and often overlooked? How does the state push back? How does the state stand up for Oregon in light of this really, I think, dysfunctional time in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, the people who developed our constitutional system were very wise. And they created a federal system in anticipation that there would be times when the center wouldn't work very well. And that's when we need to push this policy making and decision and innovation to the state level. And there's the mechanism to do that within our current constitutional structure. I don't have confidence right now that we're going to see that gridlock in Washington, D.C. end anytime soon. And that's where it's so important in places like Oregon, and so important with people in this room, that we solve our own problems. No one's going to be coming in from Washington, D.C., I believe, and help us solve some of these big issues.
We wouldn't listen to him anyway.
Yeah, we probably wouldn't listen to him. I just think it's too hard. We're too diverse. We're too big of a country with too many resources. And that's the beauty and the elegance of the federal system, because as this country has grown, that should be pushed closer to the people who deserve and need those services. And I'd take it one step farther. As our state government becomes, unfortunately, less functional, we can push it even closer to the people in regional areas in Oregon. We have a lot of diversity in this state. And that's where restructuring the CCOs and engaging them with health councils, those regions around Oregon can help solve those problems. Start impacting those social determinants of health. Start integrating all the things that people in this room know impact people's health. Having a job, being well educated, having connections to your community. Those are not things that should be solved necessarily in Salem. We can help. But people on the ground, regionally, through the CCO structure, we have an enormous opportunity here to set some groundbreaking social policy with the framework, with the foundation of CCOs allow us. You start integrating early learning hubs, you start integrating regional solutions, and you start seeing all these pieces coming together.
In the spirit of post-partisanship, give me one example where Governor Brown has been really a strong executive in your view. Even her strongest supporters have criticisms that would include things like in the healthcare space, she's not really a healthcare governor, and she's filling big shoes. Her strongest supporters would say, look, we're not seeing a lot of leadership from her in terms of in a number of ways. That's their opinion that they convey to me. Her strongest critics, though, would say what great things about, or better than average things.
Yeah, I think Governor Brown's commitment to the environment is admirable. I think that's been the origin of her career. She's focused on those issues. I think it's a big concern. Now, I would differ on the implementation of some of those ideas in the directions. I think the overall perspective that we need to make sure that we have a sustainable economy, that people can have safe air to breathe, clean water. I think those are very admirable, the focus she places on that. Now, do I think there's much innovation with regards to addressing those things? No. Do I think there's some really interesting things you can do to more meaningfully impact the environmental impact in Oregon? Certainly.
Yeah. So for people in the room or people who watch when we distribute this online, if they want to get involved in your campaign, where do they go?
Sure. You can find us either on Facebook at Dr. Knute Buehler or on our website at knutebuehler.com.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
And as not everyone knows, I'm class of 93, Ben High Lava Bear.
Is that
so
right?
I
Wow.
appreciate your service
Yeah,
for Central Oregon.
Right.
Your counsel to this room is what? For people who are trying to navigate this time of political uncertainty, what would you say to folks here and watching online?
Yeah. Always, throughout history, when there is a lot of government dysfunction at the center, the problems start getting solved more on the local level, at the community level. And that's where I'd concentrate my efforts. I think there's enormous potential there, especially with the structure that we've set up in Oregon with the CCOs, with the early learning hubs, with regional solutions, to really deliver social policy and develop social policy in a much different way. And I'm very optimistic about that.
Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.